The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 4, Language, and addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to use simple sentences appropriately and correctly, and construct acceptable compound and complex sentences by using clauses, phrases, and conjunctions. Look at these cars going past. Cars are like English grammar, full of useful parts that work together with energy to get somewhere. Cars get you places, and so does a clear understanding of grammar. Here's a car with a wheel missing. It's not going to go far, even though the engine is fine. Cars with all their wheels, with 4 good tires, will go fine like the main clause of a sentence. But take 1 or 2 wheels off and you get a subordinate clause. It can't travel on its own, remember? Last time we looked at the adverbial clause, which told us more about the verb in the sentence. Today we are going to look at the adjectival clause. We will learn how to spot them and how they function, so let's get busy. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to identify an adjectival clause and understand the function of adjectival clauses. A clause is a group of words that contains a finite verb. A clause sometimes behaves like a part of speech. Remember, all sentences have at least one clause, and you can spot the clause because it has a finite verb in it. Remember the mind map we looked at last time? Here it is again. This shows how sentences split up into different parts. Last time we learnt about adverbial clauses. Those clauses worked as adverbs in sentences. They gave us more information about the verb. If adverbial clauses act like adverbs, giving info about verbs, what do you think adjectival clauses will do? If you guessed they act like adjectives, you would be so right. But before we go on, who remembers what an adjective is? Think about this. It's a while since we talked about adjectives. An adjective is a word that gives more information about a noun. And nouns, of course, are the names for things. And what else do nouns name? People, places, objects, feelings, and ideas. Nouns are names. So, just as the adverbial clauses act like adverbs, giving us more info about the verb, so adjectival clauses act like adjectives, giving us more info about nouns. You knew that, didn't you? So all we need to do is identify a noun such as tire, and any word which gives more information about it will be an adjective. Let's look at the words which tell us more about the noun tire. Each word gives clear info to build a picture in our minds of what the actual tire looks like. A worn tire is one that has no tread left on it. You drive with one of those and it could burst and cause an accident, and you could get a fine. A flat tire means there's no air in it. It could have a puncture. You can't drive the car. A truck tire is huge. Some are bigger and heavier than me. In each case, the adjective gave us a completely different picture of the same noun. In the same way, an adjectival clause builds a clearer picture of a noun or a pronoun, although instead of being one word, it will be a group of words. Here is a definition of an adjectival clause. An adjectival clause is a group of words containing a finite verb that does the work of an adjective. An adjectival clause qualifies a noun or pronoun. By the way, just to remind you, a pronoun is a word that stands in the place of a noun like he, she, me, I, you, it, this, and those. Lesson we learnt about adverbial clauses. So let's apply what we learnt about adverbial clauses to adjectival clauses. Just remember that instead of doing the work of an adverb, adjectival clauses do the work of adjectives. So we need to relate them to nouns and pronouns rather than to verbs. Let's have a look at some examples. Have a look at this sentence. The smoker threw his cigarette near the pumps which leaked petrol. Do you remember our strategy for analyzing a sentence? What do we do first? We underline the finite verbs. Where are the finite verbs in this sentence? They are threw and leaked. The smoker threw his cigarette near the pumps, which leaked petrol. If there are two finite verbs in the sentence, how many clauses will there be? Remember that there are always the same number of finite verbs as there are clauses. Two finite verbs tell us that there will be two clauses. Now we have to work out which is the main clause. Remember, a main clause can stand on its own and make sense. So which is the main clause? If we look critically at this sentence, we can see that the words which leaked petrol is a group of words which contains a finite verb, so it is a clause. But if we take out this part of the sentence, the rest, the smoker threw his cigarette near the pumps, can stand on its own and still make sense. From this, we can work out which leaked petrol is a subordinate clause. It gives more information, but it can't stand on its own. Do you remember that clauses sometimes behave like a part of speech? Take another look at this sentence, specifically the subordinate clause. What are the words doing? They are telling us more about the noun pumps. This clause works as an adjective because it gives us more info about the noun. It is a subordinate adjectival clause qualifying or describing the noun pumps. How can you spot an adjectival clause? Here is a useful tip. An adjectival clause most often starts with a word that relates back to a noun. For example, who, whom, whose, which, and that. They are called relative pronouns because they relate back to the noun. A relative pronoun is a word which relates back to a noun. For example, who, whom, whose, which, and that. Usually, an adjectival clause starts with a relative pronoun. However, because there are exceptions, we must always look carefully at the work the clause is doing. What is the meaning? What is the sense? So read the sentence and check the meaning before you finally decide. So far, we have only looked at one example of an adjectival clause. The only way to check that we've got the whole story about adjectival clauses is to try some more examples. The teenager who carried an empty can hoped for some free petrol. So let's see how easily we can identify the parts of this sentence. The teenager who carried an empty can hoped for some free petrol. Do you remember the logical steps that we need to apply to do this? Find the finite verbs, then identify the main clause, and see how many subordinate clauses there are. Then see what word the subordinate clause tells you more about, and look at the starting words for each subordinate clause. Then decide which type of subordinate clause it is. Okay, first step, find the finite verbs. It's getting easy now, isn't it? They are carried and hoped. There are two clauses because there are two finite verbs. Now we need to identify the main clause. Which part of this sentence can stand by itself? The main clause is, the teenager hoped for some free petrol. There is only one subordinate clause, who carried an empty can. Our next step, look at the first word of the subordinate clause. It is who. What part of speech is who? It is a relative pronoun. It relates back to the noun teenager. Do you remember that a clause which starts with a relative pronoun like who will almost always be an adjectival clause? Let's see if this is likely from the meaning of this sentence. The teenager who carried an empty can hoped for some free petrol. The clause who carried an empty can relates back to what or who? The noun in the main clause, teenager. The teenager carried the can. So this is a subordinate adjectival clause qualifying or describing the noun teenager. Okay, let's give ourselves a pat on the back. We've covered adjectival clauses. But before we sit back and clutch out, let's take one last look. Here is a sentence. The truck driver looked at the neon fast food sign which flashed in the night. The finite verbs have been underlined. Two finite verbs show there will be two clauses. One of them is going to be the main clause. It is clear that the main clause is, the truck driver looked at the neon fast food sign. That makes which flashed in the night the subordinate clause. The subordinate clause has been introduced with the word which. This is a relative pronoun, so we can guess that the subordinate clause is an adjectival clause. Let's double check that. Which flashed in the night is telling us more about what? About the sign. Sign is a noun, so this is a subordinate adjectival clause qualifying or describing the noun sign. Sentence analysis doesn't have to be difficult. Start by knowing your parts of speech. Make sure you can spot verbs and nouns. Make sure you can spot adverbs and adjectives. Get lots of practice. Take a magazine and choose some sentences and find the parts of speech. Sentence analysis is easy if you know the parts of speech. Then, when you know your parts of speech, you just apply the step-by-step approach to analyze the clauses. Now you should be able to identify an adjectival clause. That, of course, is one that starts with a relative pronoun and which relates directly to a noun or pronoun in the main clause. To check if you can do this, here is today's task. The taxi, which had faulty brakes, ploughed into the oncoming traffic. In this sentence, identify the finite verbs, identify the main and subordinate clauses, state what type of subordinate clause is given, and give a reason for your answer. In the next grammar lesson, we will cover gender nouns. Until then, keep talking, reading and writing, and don't forget to analyze some sentences. It'll get you places.